Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. By Tandem Diabetes Care, makers of the t:slim X2 insulin pump. And by Real Good Foods, real food you feel good about eating.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, looking at prevention of type 1 diabetes. The people at TrialNet and others are working on making it a reality.
You know, we're getting so much closer to the point where I can really say to somebody who's been newly diagnosed, I have something I can actually do for you. And this may no longer be just a research question. I mean, there'll always be research questions because we can improve on things, but I may have a real therapy besides what we've been doing now for, close to 100 years, which is just give you insulin.
That's Dr. Michael Haller. We'll talk to him about some recent breakthrough studies, about what TrialNet actually does, how the studies work, and a lot more. In our community connection this week, Project 50 in 50 hits a big roadblock. This was actually a very big scare. We're going to tell you about it, and we'll find out what's next for these two outdoor adventurers. And in Tell Me Something Good, a little bit about meeting some of you in person and the power of saying yes. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. So glad to have you along. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and here on Diabetes Connections, we aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connection. My son was diagnosed with type 1 right before he turned 2 back in 2006. He is going into high school in a couple of weeks. Holy cow. I myself don't have diabetes. I have a background in broadcasting. I spent my career in radio and television news, and that's how you get the podcast. So this week is one of our Diabetes Connections extras. All year long, we're doing this for the last week of the month, which means you're going to hear an excerpt of the interview with Dr. Haller, and the full interview will run all by itself as a bonus episode in just a few days. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast, and that way it automatically comes to you. If you don't know how to subscribe, we've made it very easy. We've got a brand new website. Have you checked out diabetes-connections.com yet? It looks brand new. We've been working on it for a while, and if you scroll down past the current episode and the recent episodes, there is an entire panel dedicated to subscribing to the show on whatever podcast app you can think of. We may not have them all, but I think we came pretty close to at least most of the main ones. You should just be able to click on it. You may have to search up Diabetes Connections when you're there, but that's really the easiest way to get the show delivered right to your smartphone or even to your computer. So let me know if you have any trouble. You can always post in the Facebook group, but subscribe, and then the extra episode will pop up automatically in just a couple of days. And I mentioned the Facebook group. That is the best way to really keep in touch over the most breaking news that we have here. I announced my book 2 weeks ago, and we launched The World's Worst Diabetes Mom, Real Life Stories, Raising a Child with Type 1 Diabetes at Friends for Life at that big conference. I'll have more about Friends for Life later on in the show, but just a quick word about the book. We are available still for pre-orders on the website. I will have some more specials. I definitely want to tell you about that. We had a discount run for Friends for Life, and if you weren't able to take advantage of that, I'm a terrible salesman, but we'll have more. The book itself will be available for order in the fall. I'm saying November 1st. My publisher is confirming all that with me. Definitely by November 1st, but it may be earlier, so stick around and we will let you know. I'm so excited about the response I'm getting for this. It's all about learning from mistakes. I mean, we try to have a sense of humor about these things. You know, I take diabetes itself very seriously, but I don't take myself all that seriously. So the book is about strength through learning and letting yourself fail, giving yourself permission to fail, knowing that your child really will be okay. Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. One Touch has been a trusted brand in blood glucose management for more than 30 years. This past year, Pharmacy Times and U.S. News & World Report named One Touch as a #1 pharmacist-recommended brand in blood glucose monitoring devices based on a survey of pharmacists nationwide. Find out more about One Touch brand products at diabetes-connections.com and click on the One Touch logo. My guest this week is the Chief of Pediatric Endocrinology at the University of Florida. He's the principal investigator or co-investigator of some incredibly promising studies going on right now to try to prevent type 1 diabetes. Now, we have talked about TrialNet here on the show. I will let Dr. Haller explain more of that in just a moment. But in June of this year, TrialNet made headlines by announcing the first real delay in the onset of type 1 diabetes. They were able to delay it by 2 years. Dr. Haller talked to me about what that means, how they do these studies, and how we can help. Dr. Haller, thanks so much for joining me. Exciting times. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
My pleasure to be here.
Okay, before we get into the prevention studies that came out and other things that are going on, let's really kind of dial back and start at the beginning. Can you tell me a little bit about what TrialNet is, what you're trying to do?
Sure. So TrialNet is an NIH-funded consortium of the top type 1 diabetes centers across the U.S. and Canada and even Europe and Australia. And our goal is to try and develop therapies to ultimately prevent and reverse diabetes. And to achieve that goal, we have to identify patients who are either newly diagnosed with type 1, so we can encourage them to participate in research studies, trying new drugs to see if we can protect their remaining beta cells, extend their honeymoon phase, and hopefully eventually get to reversal of their disease. And then the bigger chunk of what TrialNet does is actually tries to identify folks who are at high risk for developing type 1 diabetes by screening family members of people who are already affected with type 1 to see if they have markers of autoimmunity, and then either follow them to see if they progress to being higher risk or put them in prevention trials aimed at trying to delay their disease. And so that's really the main emphasis of TrialNet. It's a huge operation, as you can imagine. Trying to identify people who are at risk for type 1 is not easy because people don't walk around with a name tag on that says, "Hi, my name is Mike. I'm at risk for type 1." We have to draw their blood and identify markers in their blood, and we have to talk people through why they would want to do that. So it's an exciting time for all those efforts, but it's certainly a big challenge.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to skip around here a little bit, so forgive me if as you listen, this sounds out of order, but I have to jump ahead because the news came really recently that we had the first study to show that any drug can delay type 1 diabetes, the diagnosis. Can you talk to us about this? And I'll guess I'll try to say it, but what is the name of this study? Teplizumab?
I'll do it for you.
Sorry.
It's called teplizumab. It's a mouthful. Teplizumab is a monoclonal antibody designed to track the parts of the immune system to knock out or kill cells that have a marker on them called CD3. And CD3 is sort of like a name tag, to use that analogy again, for these kinds of cells that are going out and attacking the pancreas. Now, unfortunately, it's not so specific that it only attacks those cells that might be targeted at the pancreas. There's some collateral damage that it gets rid of other cells that are part of the immune system. But that's the big challenge in type 1. Is trying to find drugs that can get rid of the cells that we want to get rid of and not the ones we want to keep. But the results of this study are really truly exciting and paradigm shifting for the field. As you mentioned, this is the first time in the history of type 1 that we've been able to show that anything can really durably delay or prevent the disease from progressing. So what that study did was take patients, like I mentioned, who are high risk for developing type 1, so family members of somebody who has type 1, who had markers in their bloodstream that told us they were going to progress to clinical disease where they'd need to take insulin in the next several years. And they were treated with this drug, this immunomodulatory drug, teplizumab. And what the data have now shown, and the paper was recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine, was that, in fact, the drug did delay onset of type 1, which means there was actual prevention in some of the patients, on average, for at least 2 years. And so while it's certainly not a home run, we can't guarantee that we're preventing the disease forever in the patients who received the active drug versus who received the placebo agent. It's a huge win for the field of type 1. It establishes the proof of concept that we really can effectively change the natural history of the disease. And I hope that it accelerates our efforts to do more and more studies with other drugs like teplizumab and adding additional agents to try to get an even better effect for our patients so that we can ultimately say, hey, it makes sense to screen everybody for their risk for type 1 sort of as a public health initiative and treat them with these drugs to prevent them from getting the disease.
Wow. Yeah, something I've always wondered, and I don't know if you can answer this, why is it so difficult to prevent or treat autoimmune conditions? It's not just type 1, right? I mean, nobody's cured or really prevented an autoimmune disease, have they?
Yeah, it is a challenging beast. The immune system is really smart even when it's confused about what it's supposed to do. And so once the immune system has decided it wants to attack self-tissues, which is what we mean by autoimmune disease, and in type 1 we just are specifically looking at the immune system attacking beta cells, it figures out all kinds of different pathways to get to that end and cleverly changes the way it does it. And so it's in fact probably not surprising that it's been so challenging just given the way autoimmune diseases in general come about and specifically how type 1 happens. And in the type 1 space, we're further challenged by the fact, and it's a good challenge in the sense that we've gotten better at caring for diabetes. So people reasonably would say, I don't want to take a therapy that's a risky agent or drug to prevent or reverse the disease because I can potentially take care of diabetes with insulin and pumps and continuous glucose monitors. Now, I don't live with diabetes personally, but I have a personal connection to it. My grandfather had type 1, and I take care of patients every day. And while I understand that argument, the majority of my patients I talk to say, and I fully understand that living with type 1 is incredibly challenging and hard, and more patients than not are actually willing to accept a little bit of risk for the potential benefit of delaying the disease. And certainly a 2-year delay for most families who've now lived through this would be tremendous. And most folks who have gone through that would say, man, if I could have just gotten my kid from 6 to 8 or 8 to 10 or 10 to 12 or any amount of time, some even say a day would be worth it, that'd be totally fine.
What's next for teplizumab? Is this study kind of done? Do you now start something new to see if you can prevent it longer? What happens next?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So we obviously met the study's primary endpoint and published those data. But now there are lots of questions to ask and answer, which is how long does the benefit last in those who got treated? And what happens if we retreat some of those patients who got drug, appear to be responders, and still haven't developed type 1? Can we extend the benefit even longer if we give them another course of the drug? And so TrialNet is actively looking at those options right now. I think one of the challenges for teplizumab specifically is it's not an FDA-approved drug for anything at this point. It's still been, even though it has a long history of being developed for this purpose and being tested in the type 1 space multiple times, in new onsets and now in this prevention space, it's still never been licensed. So despite the excitement about it, you can't just go out and get this today from your endocrinologist or anybody else. The only way to get it would be through a study. So the company that owns it is certainly very actively trying to do new and additional studies, both in newly diagnosed patients. In fact, they've just opened up a study that's not part of TrialNet, but it's by the company. And then TrialNet is going to be doing some version of either a retreatment study or treatment with teplizumab plus other agents is likely to come down the road, because we all still believe, given to your early question about the complexity of autoimmunity, that we're going to have to do more than just a single drug to kind of get us over the end zone. We're probably going to require combination therapies or what we call induction and maintenance therapy. So first treating with teplizumab and then some other drug to keep the effect going.
Right back to Michael talking about another study. I'm going to ask him about that. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And here's what I have to say about Basal IQ, the Dexcom G6 tandem pump software program. We are doing less work for better results. I should probably say that again. Less work, better results. Yeah, with diabetes. I know, I'm amazed too. Benny liked seeing his CGM on his pump, but honestly, that was more of a cool feature. I mean, he looked at his phone a lot more, but there's some secret sauce in the Basal IQ that keeps Benny more steady. His time in range has increased significantly since we started Basal IQ. And I don't talk about specific numbers, but I have shared that his A1C has come down. I mean, when you have an A1C come down with fewer lows, we're really happy. Of course, individual results may vary. To learn more, just go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Now back to my interview with Dr. Haller. Another recently completed study, is my understanding, is ATG, GCSF. Can you talk us through a little bit of what that one is?
Sure. So the study of anti-thymocyte globulin, or ATG, and GCSF, which stands for granulocyte colony stimulating factor, I apologize, it's a lot of letters and names, has been a labor of love and a passion of mine personally for the last decade or so. And the work that came out of that really is a beautiful example of the importance of translational science that came out of my institution at the University of Florida. So the story is really interesting. There was a transplant immunologist who was using fairly aggressive, what's called non-myeloablative transplant approaches for people with really severe bad autoimmune diseases like end-stage rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis. And he was having really impressive outcomes. But his approach was really quite aggressive. It would be akin to almost doing chemotherapeutic treatment for these patients. And so he started to talk about the potential of using that approach in type 1 diabetes. And honestly, the U.S. type 1 community just wasn't willing to think about that because the risk level was so much higher and we hadn't really had any successes yet. So he ultimately took that approach to a group in Brazil and did new onset patients with this approach there. And to date, it's still probably the most potent way to provide a short-term reversal of type 1 diabetes that we've seen in newly diagnosed patients. And so our group was really interested in that, but felt we really have to dissect this, take it apart, deconstruct it, and try to put it back together in a way that would make sense for treating kids in a U.S. audience because the risk there was just too high. And so we went from the bedside essentially back to the bench, and we started doing animal studies in a mouse model of type 1 and found that two of the drugs that they used in this sort of very complicated approach really gave us the most bang for our buck. And those two drugs ended up being anti-thymocyte globulin, ATG, and GCSF. And so once we had demonstrated that repeatedly in the animals, we decided we would do a pilot study in humans. And the first thing we did was actually study this in folks who had what we call established type 1 diabetes, people who had diabetes for at least 4 months, but as long as 2 years, because that population often largely has been ignored in the type 1 intervention space, even though we now know that many of those patients have lots of beta cell function still around. And what we were able to show was that the combination provided for almost a 40% preservation of their ability to make beta cells, to make insulin, out to 2 years after a 2-day treatment of anti-thymocyte globulin and a 12-week course of the GCSF. And so that was really exciting, but we wanted to then continue to move it sort of earlier in the disease process to new onsets and ultimately into the prevention space. So at that point, we convinced TrialNet and the NIH to fund a large confirmatory study similar to the teplizumab study we just talked about, but in new onsets to see if the low dose of ATG with or without the GCSF could provide protection for beta cell function and improve A1C. And we've now published 1 year and more recently 2-year data. And in fact, we did show that. So the most interesting finding was perhaps that the low dose of ATG by itself was able to provide for the most robust preservation of beta cell function and reduction of hemoglobin A1C in newly diagnosed patients. And so why I'm really excited about this approach is sort of related to what we just talked about before with teplizumab, in that anti-thymocyte globulin has been around for 25 years. It's a commonly used medicine in hospitals every day. It's primarily used for pretreatment of folks getting kidney transplants. But in that indication, they use it at a 10 times higher dose. So we're using it as a very minimal dose of this drug, and we still need to do more studies to confirm our observations. But the pathway to taking it into the clinical care of patients is perhaps a little bit more direct because it's been around and it already has a label. Now, of course, we'd have to do additional studies to get a label for it in the type 1 space, and that's being considered right now. But I'm excited about the opportunity to continue to study ATG. I think it's very similar to teplizumab in many ways. It has some advantages in that it only requires a 2-day infusion instead of a 14-day one. And so the next step is for TrialNet to start a prevention study, and that study is being planned as we speak. That would be very similar to the teplizumab study that we talked about. So taking high-risk patients, giving them a low dose of ATG, and following them to see if, in fact, that can prevent them from progressing to clinical diabetes where they need insulin.
So exciting. And you mentioned people with type 1 who are not newly diagnosed. Let's just talk about that for a moment, because I agree. I think there's a feeling that, well, these prevention studies are fabulous. And, one day we'll make sure that, no one develops type 1, but what about the people who do have it? Were you surprised? Or I guess I should ask you, put that in perspective for us, that discovery that they're still producing beta cells, that something can still be done here.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that. I think one of the best ways to think about it was an analogy that previous director of the JDRF made, which was if you think about an hour of the clock as being the amount of time somebody lives with type 1 diabetes, the new onset phase, which is the first 100 days where we've normally done these studies, is like less than a minute. And so we ignore the whole rest of the population who live with type 1, many of whom fund our research through being donors or advocates. We sort of leave them out of the opportunity to participate. So one, that's wrong morally, and two, it's wrong because we now have better science that demonstrates that people with type 1, especially those who were diagnosed a little older, unfortunately not kids like your son who were diagnosed so young, but people who are diagnosed as teens or even young adults often have functional beta cell mass for years. Even 5 to 10 years is not uncommon. And that's quite variable, but we can measure that and know. And those patients are potentially a huge population who might benefit from some of these immunotherapies that we're talking about. So I think you're starting to see the pharmaceutical companies and the scientists who work with these drugs design trials to sort of re-enfranchise that population that's long been left out. So we felt that it was a very exciting and important finding from our study, our first study of ATG and GCSF, and now we are seeing other studies like it coming along.
All right, so let's just go backwards for a moment and talk about people diagnosed very young, like my son who was diagnosed at 23 months. I hate to hear something like that, but I have to ask, can you elaborate on what you meant by that, and what is the age of, I know it's not, nature has no real cutoffs, but, what ages are you talking about there?
Yeah, so unfortunately, kids who are diagnosed under 4 to 5 years of age tend to have a more rapid and severe disease in that their beta cell mass is less when they're diagnosed, and they just may retain less over a shorter period of time. And it's a little bit obvious, somebody who made it to 30 or 40 or 50 years of age before they developed type 1 obviously had a slower progression of disease. So in some sense, it's not too surprising that their progression after the day they need insulin is going to be slower than in somebody who unfortunately develops type 1 at 23 months. But as you can imagine, it's incredibly variable. That's one of the challenges of type 1. There's so many flavors of type 1s, and every individual patient is different. Having done this now for 20 years, I still, every time I walk into a patient's room, their diabetes is different than the patient I saw before, and it'll be different than the patient I see next. And that's probably true for some of the biology of what's going on with the immune attack. And so it's probably not a one-size-fits-all, or won't be a one-size-fits-all approach. And we have to get better at personalized medicine. So, what may work as a therapy to prevent diabetes in a 10 or 15-year-old or even a 30 or 40-year-old is going to be different ultimately than what will likely work for somebody who's, a year or two old and really high risk.
It's really interesting. As a mom, I'm disappointed. I don't want to hear things like that. But for the purpose of the interview here and the information, it's really interesting. And it kind of explains Benny, my son, had basically no honeymoon. Once he was diagnosed, and we were very fortunate, he wasn't in DKA. It was not an emergency situation that day. But boom, that was it. Looking back, we never had a honeymoon period. And I wonder if that's why.
Yeah, that's pretty common experience, unfortunately, for kids diagnosed that young. They just trash their beta cell mass so quickly that they effectively don't get a honeymoon. Yeah.
I shouldn't laugh, but that's a great way to put it. My son will be thrilled to know that he totally leveled it. He did, in one fell swoop.
He killed it. He knocked it out of the park. Not the game you want to win, unfortunately, but you mentioned something else that's a really key factor, which is that he fortunately didn't develop DKA, but still, even in the U.S., 30 to 40% of new onsets come in DKA, and sadly that number continues to go up, not down. That's another really critical reason to do screening programs. While we can't yet justify general global screening for the purposes of preventing DKA, people who have a family history of type 1 certainly should get screened in TrialNet and be followed, because we know very good data that folks who are followed in these studies have a marked reduction in the likelihood of DKA for a subsequent family member who unfortunately might be developing type 1. And so while economically it doesn't make sense, obviously no parent who's gone through this would say that they wouldn't do something to prevent DKA in another child who might have to deal with it. And we're talking about a reduction from 30 to 40%, which we're seeing in the general community, down to 5% or less. So that's a huge secondary benefit of participating in these trials.
One thing that has come up recently, though, unfortunately, and as you say, you want to do more screening, but TrialNet seems to have had the funding cut back. Can you talk a little bit about the changes that have come? Because I did get, when I told people we were going to be talking about prevention and I was speaking to TrialNet, I heard from a few people who said, ask them how long the changes are going to go on. So let's explain what has changed.
No, I appreciate you asking that question. And for all your listeners, we appreciate your ongoing advocacy. Keep speaking up, being loud about the value you find in these programs. Talk to, your congressmen and senators. Ultimately, that's where the money comes from. TrialNet is funded by the National Institutes of Health, and we get a bit of a special allocation of money called the Special Diabetes Project, SDP monies, that fortunately looks like it's going to move forward with some newer funding. But yes, we did recently face some budgetary cuts because of decisions that had to be made at the NIH level. And because of that, we had to strategically talk about how much screening we could do to still identify the highest risk patients that we need to put in these prevention trials. And part of that calculus resulted in us having to cut back on the frequency with which we had previously been doing repeat screenings. But I completely agree with all the upset families out there. Part of the huge value of being part of our TrialNet family was being able to come back in for rescreening every year, and either knowing that your kid wasn't at increased risk this year, or finding out that unfortunately they were, but knowing that therefore that meant you would get closer follow-up and potentially be in a prevention trial. So I remain hopeful that decision will be overturned, to be short-lived, but at the end of the day, it's a purely economic one, and so. If any of your listeners have influence, or and everybody can, don't be shy about giving that feedback to either your TrialNet center if you're already in TrialNet, or talking to your legislators about why you think this is important.
We have international listeners as well, because TrialNet's not just in the U.S. Are these funding issues in like the U.K. as well?
Thanks for bringing that up, too. So TrialNet is mostly funded by the NIH, but we also get some funding in kind from the JDRF. And the JDRF funding has largely been used in the past to help us maintain the international centers. Oh. And so, they, as a group, given that we use the funding all the same, are affected in the same way as it relates to this current screening change, because we can't have a different program in different countries. But again, hopefully as funds will come back to the network, we will be having the ability to increase our screening programs. And I should say, some of the screening things need to be changed anyway, because the network is evolving and we're learning more, and we have better, more precise ways of doing things. But some of the changes that were made were certainly a little bit more draconian than we had hoped.
I don't know if you can answer this, but I'll ask it anyway. Is it difficult to see patients who are kids? I mean, my son has a great relationship with his endocrinologist. We've been able to see the same one, luckily, from ages 2 to now he's 14. And I wonder, is it difficult to know that you're researching, you're trying to do prevention and, which hopefully even someday cure, but the research is slow. I mean, and we understand why. It's not a criticism, but the research is slow and the patients are growing up. Is it difficult on any kind of emotional level to look at your patients and feel like, gosh, I really want to help these people more, but, the research just isn't as fast as we all would like it to be? Does that make sense?
It's so incredibly frustrating. Frankly, it pisses me off, but it's part of why I get up every morning and come to work, and I'm excited to move things forward. I mean, the pace of research is glacially slow, and I'm not a patient guy. So I've lost my cool more than one time trying to promote what I think is important research so that we can get these things to our patients faster. And that's why I mentioned it. I think like a clinical guy. I just happened to do the research because at the end of the day, that's what pulled me into research. I realized that was what we had to do to get the patients better care. So yeah, I find the process, it's necessary. It's what we have to do. We have to do good science, and that takes time. But sometimes the administrative burdens or the funding lags, those things can just be so mind-numbingly frustrating that really good people unfortunately sometimes leave the field, and so I would encourage people not to do that. Of course, we need people to stay passionate about type 1 and do the hard work of the research and the clinical care. But yeah, I have to go to clinic and look people in the eye and say, sorry, I don't have anything that's good enough for you yet. And I emphasize the yet, but that's a hard conversation to have with people day in, day out.
Wow. I'm glad I asked. I wasn't sure that question was going to go anywhere. Sometimes people look at me like I'm crazy when I ask things like that.
No, it's not crazy at all. And it's part of why I'm excited about the anti-thymocyte globulin and ultimately CD3 and all these other things because, we're getting so much closer to the point where I can really say to somebody who's been newly diagnosed, I have something I can actually do for you. And this may no longer be just a research question. There'll always be research questions because we can improve on things, but I may have a real therapy besides what we've been doing now for close to 100 years, which is just give you insulin. Obviously, we're better at doing that too, but it sure would be nice to do something besides that.
Mike, we've talked a lot about, exciting studies and some setbacks and how long things take and the frustration. Are you still jumping out of bed, excited to do this research?
More than ever. It's a really exciting time to be here because we now have stuff that looks like it actually works. The feeling in the room in the last decade when we kept going to meetings and reporting negative events was certainly weighing on everybody heavily. And so to be able to come to the American Diabetes Association and report these data nationally and internationally in the last couple of years with the outcomes like thymoglobulin and CD3 really has been a huge boost to everybody's morale, and I think puts us in a really great space because we can continue to argue that people should be getting screened. We should be doing these studies because we are effectively changing the natural history of the disease. So I'm really excited about where we're going, and I just hope we can get there faster.
Wow. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining me. We'll put all the information about TrialNet in the show notes so that people can learn more and find out how to get screened. But I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining me today.
That's been my absolute pleasure.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
You can hear the entire interview with Dr. Haller in just a couple of days on our Diabetes Connections Extra, a bonus episode that'll be out soon. And I will also link up, as usual, much more information about TrialNet, about these studies in the show notes. You get those by just wherever you're listening. There's usually a little details or more here button. You can click on that or just go to the homepage of the website, and every episode has these show notes. I hope that helps you. I also put time cues in if you want to refer back to the episode and exactly figure out where you want to listen. Just try to make it easier for you. Our community connection this week, man, we are catching up with Project 50 in 50, but these guys had a pretty bad scare. They are dealing with the unexpected. Community Connection is brought to you by Tandem, and we started using the t:slim X2 insulin pump from Tandem Diabetes Care in August of 2017. Wow, 2 years ago already. We'd seen it, we'd loved the look, but I care most, of course, about how well it works. It's fabulous inside and out. Using a touchscreen, there's no more scrolling through menus. As an in-warranty customer, we were able to plug Benny's pump into our home computer, download the new Basal IQ feature. So simple. New features on the same pump from home. To find out more about Benny's pump, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Tandem logo. We've been bringing you updates about Project 50 in 50 since these guys kicked it off. Patrick Mertes and Michael Shelver both live with type 1 diabetes. They're both avid outdoorsmen. They're both also very active with camps and kids and programs. And the idea here was to summit the highest peak in all 50 states in 50 days. They were on an incredible pace beginning at the very end of June when they started in Alaska. They had made it to 35 peaks. But my understanding is when they were trying to come down from Granite Peak in Montana, they both separately lost their footing. Now, Patrick was okay, but Michael fell about 150 yards. And he had sustained significant injuries. They were carrying a personal locator beacon. In fact, Patrick posted, never enter the backcountry without one. They did get a search and rescue helicopter within 2 hours. And Michael was, they said he was packaged up, and they were both flown off of the mountain, taken to the hospital. I will let Patrick pick it up from there. I spoke to him several days ago as you're listening now. I will post it on Facebook and in social media if anything significant has changed, but I just wanted to have him on and hear his voice and let him tell you a little bit more about what happened. Wow, Patrick, thank you so much for spending a couple of minutes with me. The timing of this may come out a little odd. We're talking a few days before the podcast goes live. We know things can change, but how are you doing right now? Give us the update.
Sure. So I am actually in our mobile headquarters right now, which is our Sprinter van. I'm in Billings, Montana still. Mm-hmm. Michael and his father just flew back to where Michael grew up in the Bay Area of California. And Michael's going to start some physical therapy and going to see a lot of specialists over the course of the next few days. And once we've kind of gathered more information on that end, we can start making some clearer decisions on exactly what the future of the project is going to look like. So Michael and I are both very committed to finishing this project, but we also want to make sure that we're finishing in a way that's not going to have any kind of long-term injuries on Michael's behalf, and we're doing it in a safe way that really embodies the message that we're trying to put forward with the project.
Yeah, I mean, you've been so open on social media, and I'll link up some videos and things where you shared what happened. But I'm just curious, you had already summited, you were on your way back down. Just to be clear, you both lost your footing at different times, but you weren't badly hurt, right?
Correct. So, a lot of people will tell you that are involved in mountaineering that usually the most dangerous time is actually descending the mountain, which is very accurate, especially in this case. So at this point, Michael and I were no longer roped in. We were free climbing. We were using ice axes on a very steep snowfield. And I lost my footing first and fell about 25 yards before falling into kind of a rock formation or a rock field. And I did a quick assessment to make sure, I wasn't seriously injured. And as I'm kind of relaying my report to Michael is when I see that he too has lost his footing. And unfortunately, Michael fell a significantly longer distance than I did. And I actually saw the accident, which was a very scary thing to see with, someone that I'm obviously very, very close with. But given kind of the circumstances and the nature of his fall, we are just so grateful that things did not turn out more serious than they did.
Yeah, it's been wonderful to see him hopping around on crutches and joking about, tackling 50 miles on crutches and things like that. But this might be an odd question, but I just want to ask you, when it comes to diabetes and injuries like that, I mean, how does he manage? I don't want to ask I don't want to get too personal.
Sure. Well, there's a couple things we could talk about here. It's interesting. One of the coolest things is that the lead paramedic who picked us up was actually type 1, which was very helpful in that exact circumstance, because he knew exactly the things that he should be aware of during kind of those critical moments when we're trying to get Michael off the mountain and transferred to more longer term care, which was an absolute blessing in that situation. During kind of the recovery process, it's been very interesting where, because Michael was alert and awake, and he also had his dad there and myself there, that a lot of the power of managing his diabetes was still kind of left in Michael's ultimate decision-making process, which is not always the case when you're in an emergency room. So that's also been very helpful. But of course, as your body's healing and there's a lot of stress hormones that are going on, and just the fact that Michael and I have been so active for the last month and a half, and now he's bedridden, there's definitely been a bit of an adjustment period where we've kept very close eyes, and Michael has kept very close eyes on his diabetes management. And there's been a lot of adjustments that have been made from life on the trail to life in a hospital bed. But I will say, Michael's got 15 years under his belt, so it's hard to become an expert in becoming a pancreas, but he has done a really wonderful job at doing the best that he can to keep his numbers within range.
Wow. You've said something all along, this 50 and 50 project that has really stuck with me, which is all about how when you have diabetes and you have to kind of plan for the unexpected, and then maybe not have a plan but still deal with the unexpected, it kind of goes hand in hand with a project like this. I'm not trying to make too much of a metaphor here.
I think there are a lot of parallels between kind of what we're doing with the project and life with diabetes, where you can have everything in your toolkit. You could have binders and tons of information kind of at your disposal. But at the end of the day, things are going to absolutely come up. And that's kind of the nature of life within the backcountry. And that's the nature of life with living with diabetes. And, I think just being realistic with yourself in both of those circumstances and knowing that these days are going to come up kind of helps you digest it a little bit easier when you do have to kind of navigate those darker days. But, I think a lot of getting through some of these more challenging periods is keeping a positive mental attitude and knowing that if you have a strong support system, if you continue to persevere, that things do and will get better, because tomorrow is always going to be a new day.
Is that the message that you want to tell? You've met so many cool people already on this trip, and there's a lot of families, a lot of kids watching you. Is that what you would like them to take away from this?
I think the important things are from Project 50 and 50 is knowing that you're not alone. There's other people that know exactly what you're going through. Reach out to them, find your community, find your tribe, and just knowing that if you're able to keep a positive attitude, if you're able to kind of find the silver lining in life with diabetes, that you really can. You can do whatever you want to do. There's going to be some days that are worse than others, but there's also going to be days that you're going to be able to thrive and enjoy life. And really, with proper planning and relying on that support system, the goal is to have many more of those days than the days that are challenging.
What happens now to 50 in 50? Well, Patrick tells me they are still trying to figure everything out. As of our conversation, the plan was for Patrick to kind of hang out west for a while and see how Michael's doing, what physical therapy is needed, and kind of get a clearer picture of what can happen next. There are a few options that they're thinking of. I don't think they're ready to scrap this project. At least he didn't sound that way when I spoke to him. There are a few timely climbs that they must do. I mean, they have a permit for California. So if that's going to happen, they must do it on August 7th. Mount Hood, Mount Rainier are seasonal. So there are times when they have to get that finished. They're talking about maybe stopping the clock at the point where they were rescued when they entered the helicopter and then restarting it when they're back in the van. And then it's always possible too that this just may not happen at all this year. We're not quite sure of the extent of Michael's injuries, but these guys are really committed to seeing it through. I'm not sure if I mentioned the Diabetes Family Connection is the umbrella under which Project 50 and 50 is happening. It's also the group that has put on my son's diabetes camp. So I know Patrick. Thank you, Patrick, for delivering a toothbrush and some deodorant when Benny left all of his toiletries at home this summer, and for all of the many things that you all do for our kids. So I definitely have a personal connection and a personal stake in these guys. If you want to continue to cheer them on, I will link up all the information about Project 50 and 50. And if you haven't followed them yet, go back on social media and see their amazing climbs and their wonderful personalities and all the great interaction they've had with the people they've met along the way. It is time for Tell Me Something Good, and that is brought to you by Real Good Foods. Have you tried their breakfast sandwiches yet? So easy. Well, I was going to say so easy to make. You don't make them. They come ready-made. You just heat them up. But they're easy in the morning when you don't have any time. The cauliflower cheesy bread, in quotes, is delicious. And it's just nice to have something you don't have to think too much about in the morning. Big fan of their breakfast sandwiches. Benny still really likes that ultimate pizza that they make. And with a stuffed chicken is next on our list to try. It's low carb, high protein. I mean, they're calling it a sandwich, basically. So it's like 25 grams of protein, 6 grams of carb per sandwich. It comes in several varieties, including creamy spinach and artichoke, broccoli and cheese. It's available in Publix. So I got to pop on over there and check that out. You can find it a lot more at their website. Find out what stores near you carry them, or just order a bunch. That's really the best way to get the most variety. Check it out. Just go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Real Good Foods logo. For Tell Me Something Good this week, I'm going to get to the ones that you all have sent in. And actually, we have too many for this week, so we're going to spread them out a bit, which is a nice problem to have. But I want to just pop in one of my own, and this is from Friends for Life. This is the largest family diabetes conference, I believe, in the world. It's really a remarkable trip every year. And before I talk about it, I do want to say, look, I know that it's really hard to get to these conferences. I know they're expensive. I know it's vacation time that many of us really just don't have a lot of. And I say this because I heard this from a couple of people, and I'm just thrilled. And I hope I can do this for you, that the podcast is kind of a way to bring these conferences to you. Not everybody has a community in real life. Not everybody has mom friends that they can reach out to. So if we can do that for you just a little bit by hearing my stories, or more importantly, those of my guests and the other stories that I bring to you, I would really consider this podcast an amazing success. That's what it's here for. And I did hear from several people who told me separately and kind of privately that they either get emotional when they listen to the podcast, or, they do feel like they're part of a community. And I'm not bringing that up to pat myself on the back, because really, you all are doing that by telling these stories and participating in the way that you do. And even just by downloading and listening, but also to tell you that if that's you, you're not alone. If you've listened to some of these interviews and teared up a little bit, or you've heard something that you said, yes, that's me, or even, no, Stacey, you're bananas. That never happens that way. That's what a community does. We have these conversations. And I know it's kind of odd to think about having a podcast be a conversation, but it can feel like that sometimes. So when I share these stories for Friends for Life, I don't want you to feel like you're left out. I want you to feel a bit like you're there. So I talked to a woman named Heather who her child was diagnosed within the last year. We met her and had a lot of conversations, but she attended a couple of sessions. Maura McCarthy, who does my Dear D Mom with me every month, she has a terrific session about saying yes despite diabetes. If you would say yes without diabetes, you should say yes with diabetes. And Maura and I did the closing keynote together, and one of the pictures was Benny jumping off a boat when he was a teeny little kid. I think he's 3 or 4 years old, but he's got his life preserver on, and that's kind of how I approach life, right? Be prepared, be safe, and then go. Even though I'm sitting in the boat freaking out, I let him go. So Heather posted, "Thank you, Friends for Life. Thank you, Stacey and Maura. Thank you for teaching me to say yes more, to let go more, to live more. Today it was just me and my type 1 kiddo at Typhoon Lagoon." This is a Disney water park. Of course, he goes straight for the giant wave pool. I hemmed and hawed. He looked at me and said, "Mom, sometimes I feel like Nemo and you're Marlin." You remember that from the movie where Marlin didn't want Nemo to go anywhere because he was scared he'd lose him? I remember all the things I learned this week. I thought about what my new tribe would tell me to do. I vividly remembered Stacey at the closing keynote and the picture of itty bitty Benny jumping off a boat. I said yes. He, of course, lived and had the time of his life. We decided to celebrate with a giant bucket of ice cream, and that's what the picture is of. It's beautiful because now we say yes. Pro tip, no one can tell you are crying at a water park. I'm crying again reading this. Heather, thank you so much for sending that in, for posting that in the Friends for Life group, and just for doing it. Good for you. I'm so glad we could help. Benny's going to be thrilled that picture helped you out. I just love it. Christina writes in, "Both my bro and I have type 1. I enjoy your podcast. I've been wanting to share for a while. My 26-year-old younger brother, Kevin, summited Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the USA this past weekend while managing his diabetes. He's also traveled to Mexico for work several times to do research as a geologist and goes cave diving and works up to 30 feet underground, all while managing life as a type 1. And he finishes up his PhD in geology. I'm very proud of him, never letting diabetes stop him. I hope this inspires other people as other stories have for us." Wow. Christina, I want to talk to you, and I want to talk to your brother, because Benny and I were talking about cave diving, not necessarily because he wants to do it, thank goodness, but just in general and how you would manage that with type 1. So I will be following up with you for sure. Julia wrote in her "Tell Me Something Good," and Julia, thank you for this, is "I just enabled you on Alexa. And I'm sorry if I just woke up your Alexa, but you can listen to the podcast that way." And I want to share Rosalind, who says, "Camp has been great for my son. He was diagnosed last May at 7. This year he went to 2 local day diabetes camps and is now doing his own shots and Dexcom on his arms. He was terrified before. He started counting his own carbs for his meals. He can't wait to go to Sleepaway Diabetes Camp next summer. Words can't express how happy I am that he's had such a wonderful experience." Rosalind, thank you so much for sending that in. We've got lots more. I'm going to save them for the next couple of weeks and spread out all the goodness. But if you've got to tell me something good, you can always drop it in the Facebook group, Diabetes Connections, the group, or you can send it to me, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com, or tag me on social media. I'm all over the place. I'm not on Pinterest. I don't do well visually. Shocking for a person who enjoys audio. But you can find me pretty much anywhere else. Looking at the calendar. Next up is a JDRF Type 1 Summit in Virginia for the Central Virginia chapter. That is on August 17th near Richmond. So if you are in that area and thinking about going, come see me. I'm speaking at lunchtime. Always a great time to talk. Come see me. I'll be doing my presentation about making in real life diabetes connections, and I'll be talking a little bit about the world's worst diabetes mom. If you'd like me to come speak at your event, there is a form right on the website now, the new website. Did I mention the fabulous new website? You can click on community and it'll actually say where we've been, where we're going. And then there's a big old contact button. And if you'd like me to come speak at your event, just let me know. Thank you to my editor, to John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. And thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.